year because last year we made over $1,000 that we gave to various people in need in this country, in Israel, organizations, people directly. So you can donate through our website, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org.
Putting it in the comments.
I believe Sal is putting it in the comments, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Tell us who you are, where you're from, if this is your first time joining our yearly reading, or if you come every year. We'd love to hear from you. And while Sal is doing some tech stuff, I have a couple of short teaching. Well, first of all, okay, it's not going to be Purim unless we're imbibing some alcoholic beverages, right?
Making a l'chaim.
So I need a little liquid courage because I'm not as comfortable on camera as Sal is, but I still appreciate the opportunity.
You may not be comfortable, but you're good at it.
I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts and some teachings and hopefully some wisdom with you. So first, let's do a l'chaim, and please join us with whatever you're drinking, from water to scotch, coffee, whatever, anything in between. L'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'akol niyeh b'diburo.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'akol niyeh b'diburo.
Amen. Ooh, I love bourbon. Gotta just digest for a second. So I wanted to talk, first of all, I wanted to share a teaching from one of my very favorite rabbis of all time, Rabbi Avigdor Miller, who...
Wait, let me just interrupt for a second. And it's great if you put in the comments where you're tuning in from. The more comments that come in right now at the top of the show, the more the algorithm distributes our reading of the Book of Esther on Facebook and YouTube. So please let us know where you're tuning in from.
And if I have lipstick on my teeth, mention it in the comments. That's my biggest fear, is to be on camera and then realize I have lipstick on my teeth.
You look great, darling.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, so Rabbi Avigdor Miller, one of my very favorite rabbis, he was one of the greatest of the 20th century, and he was probably the first really great gadol, the first great rabbi, sage, to be born in America and to teach in English. And what I love about him is that his teachings are very understandable, even to somebody like me, who, to be perfectly honest, like, I have no formal Jewish education. I've kind of picked up some things here and there, but I grew up, sadly, I mean, I'm not complaining about my childhood, God forbid, but most of the Jews in the world don't have much connection with Judaism or tradition, etc. So I'm kind of, by the skin of my pants, trying to make my way through as a traditional Jew. And Avigdor Miller has really helped me. So one thing he says is, the main mitzvah, the main commandment of Purim, is to love your fellow, specifically to love your fellow Jew. Now, we are so thrilled to have allies. It means so much to us that there are people that are standing with us. And right now, this is really tough times for Jews. People are really afraid. And so those of you who are standing with us, who are supporting Israel at this time, God bless you. But if we expect others to stand with us, we have to stand together with each other. And that's kind of a running theme throughout Jewish history, is the problems with achieving Jewish unity. So at the time of the Purim story, the Jews were unified. They prayed together, they fasted together, and they brought about, with God's help, an amazing miracle, which we're about to hear about when we read the Megillah. So share a couple things. So number one, how do you love your fellow, and how do you show that you care about them? And so he said it's a 3-step process. The first step is you encourage them. You take an interest, ask them questions about their life. You praise them. You treat them as though they're important. You look at them in the eye and you give encouragement. The second one is you greet everyone with a pleasant countenance, with a smile. And the third one is you should bless them. When you interact with someone, you should say, may you be blessed with good health. May you be blessed with long life. May you be blessed with pride from your children. So if you encourage, smile, and bless people, that's going a really long way to make people feel good and fulfill the commandment of loving your fellow Jew, and I would say loving your fellow person. Another thing that he talked about was, why do we drink? I will take a drink just to show.
L'chaim.
how important that is. He says, when you're tipsy, you love people more. You love people more. You hug them more. And he says, if you're at a Suda, a Purim meal, so he said one of the, since our commandment on Purim is to love your fellow Jew, so the obligations of Purim demonstrate that. So one of them is Mishloach Mano, when you're bringing baskets of goodies to your friends. Another one is giving gifts to the poor. And the third one is to have a Suda, to have a festive meal. And so he said that, let's say you show up at the Suda and there's only one seat left and it's next to the one guy you really don't like, or the one woman, the person in the congregation, like, oh, I really don't like him. You're sitting next to him. There's a bottle of wine on the table. It's Purim. You pour him a glass. You pour yourself a glass. You start drinking. And he says, once you're tipsy, you're going to put your arm around him. You're going to be friendly. You're going to be a kind of hail fellow, well met. And he says, if you act like you're kind and friendly when you're tipsy or when you're forcing yourself, you will become more kind and friendly. So and he said that's the proper way to use alcohol on Purim. It's not about to get totally, plastered. It's about getting to the place where you're feeling warm and friendly towards others. So that's the Avigdor Miller teaching I wanted to share. Is it okay if I share one more teaching?
By all means, dear girl.
Okay. So the other teaching I want to share is from my dear friend Hannah Rachel Schusterman. She's an amazing Torah teacher. She has a YouTube platform where she teaches a teaching on the Parsha, 1 hour class on the Parsha every week. You can look her up, Hannah Rachel Schusterman. You want to maybe put it in the comments? ChanRachel, Hannah Rachel Schusterman. She's amazing. So she asked an important question. She said, so we know that Purim is a time of miracles. The whole Jewish people was saved from genocide by Queen Esther, by Mordecai, and by everyone, like I said, unifying, fasting, and praying together. It's a story of the miracle of our salvation. But she said, what is the actual moment? What's the turning point? What's the moment when the miracle happens? Is it when a Jewish queen is chosen and she's in the castle and has access to the king just at the moment when the Jews need an advocate the most? Is it the time when Mordecai is at the town gate and hears about a plot to kill the king, which he winds up telling the king? Is it the time when the king can't sleep at night and that's when he finds out about what's been done for him? What is the moment of the miracle? And Hannah Rachel said, every moment of the Megillah is a miracle. The whole thing is a miracle. And that's why when we hear the Megillah in the public reading, we must hear every single word. So if you're in synagogue and it's a regular Shabbat or Monday or Thursday and there's a Torah reading, obviously it's very good, very meritorious to listen to the Torah reading, but it's not like you have to hear every single word. But with the Megillah, you really are commanded to hear every single word. So you'll hear them saying repeatedly, okay, you're in charge of your kids. Keep your kids quiet. Because, there was one year when I was at a Megillah reading and there were so many screaming kids, like I didn't fulfill my obligation. So you must hear every single word because every single word is a miracle. On Purim, she says, the hidden becomes obvious, and Purim represents the world we live in. We don't live in a world where there's open miracles like the parting of the Red Sea. We live in a world where God is hidden. Just like God is hidden, God is never mentioned in the Purim story. But yet God is behind every single word of it. And so just as in the Purim story, God is hidden, but the miracles are happening and every single word represents a miracle, so too in our world, Purim represents the world we live in. And in the world we live in, we're surrounded by miracles. We just have to open our eyes and look for them. And they're there.
Beautiful.
So that's what I wanted to share. And
wow, what a great way to set up the reading. And somebody asked, yes, that's where the whole Megillah comes from. Yes, indeed. Megillah. That is where the whole Megillah, that phrase comes from.
Yeah.
I shared a link to Hannah Rachel Schusterman's YouTube channel. Renee fought. May you be blessed, you and all your loved ones in all your ways, for donating to the poor and fulfilling the mitzvah of Matanas Levoyim here by donating through us. All donations to Accidental Talmudist today are going to pass through us to the needy, right? We select certain organizations that are very low overhead and very high delivering food, shelter.
Exactly, that's important to us.
Food, shelter, exactly what the
right
needy people need.
And thank you so much, Renee. You're a really valued member of our community, and you've been an AT Daily. I haven't seen your comments for a little while, but
she always checks it at the beginning.
They're always so meaningful. Everything you say, everything you contribute to the community, and now your financial contribution. Again, it's not going to us, it's going to people in need. So thank you so much.
So anyone else who wants to donate to the poor through us, that's one of the mitzvahs of Purim. The link is in the comments, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, let us read the Book of Esther. So it is an obligation to read the Megillah or to fulfill your obligation by hearing it read. Now that is certainly supposed to be done in Hebrew. So listening to us read it in English, and it's not really live, we're not in the same room, even though we're virtually in the same room. So this does not fulfill your obligation listening to us read it. However, according to some opinions, it is permitted to read the Megillah in your own language, which is like so much better if you don't speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
So if you can get your own text in front of you, and I mean, it's easy to find online, Chabad, Megillah, there's plenty of places, the Book of Esther, Sefaria or Chabad. Just Chabad Megillah, and you can instantly have the text of the Megillah in front of you. And then if you're reading along while we're reading it, at least according to some opinions, you will have fulfilled your obligation to read the Megillah today.
Well, there you go.
Okay.
Very cool.
All right, but we don't say the bracha, the blessing, over doing that unless we're reading or hearing it in Hebrew, at least according to from a scroll, an actual scroll.
But again, that might not be realistic for everybody, so we're trying to do what we can to tell the story.
And for sure, doing your best goes a long way.
Oh, 100%.
Okay. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 1. We might insert comments here and there occasionally, but for the most part, we'll try to keep it moving. Okay, you want to start?
Sure.
Well, you've been talking a lot.
Yeah,
you can take a break. I'll start chapter 1, and that'll give you chapter 10, which I think you want to say something about.
Okay.
Okay. So here we go. The Book of Esther, reading it on Purim. The whole Megillah is what we're going to do. Chapter 1. It happened in the days of Achashverosh. He was the same Achashverosh who ruled from India to Kush, 127 provinces. In those days when King Achashverosh sat on his royal throne, which is in Shushan, the capital. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all of his ministers and servants, the army of Persia and Media, the governors and the ministers of the provinces in his presence, when he displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the splendorous beauty of his majesty. He made this feast for many days, 180 days, and when these days were completed, the king made a 7-day feast for all the people in Shushan, the capital, from the greatest to the smallest, in the courtyard of the garden of the king's orchard. And he draped white, green, and blue cloths, embroidered with threads of linen and purple wool, over silver columns and marble pillars for the guests to sit on. He arranged gold and silver divans for the guests to recline on during the feast, on a floor of various precious stones, bahat and shesh, dar and sacharet. And he instructed his butlers to pour with golden vessels. And there's a commentary in the Talmud that these are the vessels from the first temple in Jerusalem that had been destroyed by Achashverosh's predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. Predecessor in the sense that Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian Empire, which was defeated by the Persian Empire, which now Achashverosh was ruling all of it. And there was royal wine in abundance, as befitting a king. And the drinking was as appropriate, without coercion. For so had the king established, ordering all the stewards of his household to do in accordance with the desire of each and every man. Now, our sages learn out from that last verse that the Jews who participated in that feast, It's not that they were eating unkosher food. They were able to get glatt kosher food and kosher wine because every man would eat and drink according to his desire. So what was it that the Jews did, right? If we can say, and our sages will always look when the Jews have trouble, what is it that we are doing wrong? It's not victim blaming.
It's taking responsibility.
But it's taking responsibility and being accountable. Others. Right. And so what was it that the Jews did that caused us to have such a... Okay, it worked out in the end. But while it was happening, as we'll see, the Jews believed strongly that they were all going to be genocided throughout the entire world. All the Jews in the world. They believed that
because the plan was in place.
That was the plan. I mean, I'm saying that's what they expected to happen. And they were mourning and terrified. So what was it that they did that would lead to this? So says, various commentaries, and our Rav, Yekusiel Kalmanson, brought this down last night, that what they did is that, they practiced Judaism and they prayed in synagogue and they learned Torah, and that was one thing that they did. And another thing that they did is that they fawned and flattered over the king, the secular king. Right? And then when they were all invited and they were able to party with him and they were enjoying that, and they said, we're in, we're assimilated. We got it good here.
And told themselves, well, it's kosher food, so who knows what was going on?
Who knows what was going on at this
180-day
orgiastic party. But the point being that looking to God was like one of their things that they did. And, paying homage to the secular king was another thing that they did, kind of on an equal footing. And that is no way for Jews to live. Our emun, our bitachon, our faith and our trust has to only be in the Holy One above. Obviously, we have to obey the laws of the lands that we live in. Obviously, we pay our respects to the powers that be.
There's a special blessing that you're supposed to say
when you see an earthly king
or a head of state. I believe a president.
Exactly.
Whether you support that president or not, if you are in real life around near a president, prime minister, whatever, there's a special blessing that you say.
But you don't look to the secular authorities in your world as if they're somehow on a same playing field, same level as God. God is above everything, and our duty and our faith and our love and our obligation goes to God. There's no comparison, right? And that was one thing that they did that might have caused them to lose. It was not that they were punished by what happened. It was a natural consequence that they turned their hearts and minds from that direct connection with the Master of the universe and kind of equated God with these earthly powers.
Something I just heard, I'm not even sure what it means exactly, but when it says... so sometimes it refers to King Ahasuerus, and sometimes it just says king. And when it just says king Melech, then that also refers to God.
Right. It's one of the ways to read the Megillah is that when there's a verse that only mentions the king and doesn't mention Ahasuerus, since God is never mentioned in the Book of Esther, in the Megillah, but there are hidden and subtle reference. I mean, obviously the whole story is orchestrated by God, but pay special attention to verses that say the word king without mentioning Ahasuerus' name. Okay, almost done with chapter 1. So Queen Vashti likewise made a feast for the women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he ordered Mehuman, Bizeta, Charvona, Bigta, Avagta, Zetar, and Charkas, the 7 chamberlains who attended King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, adorned with the royal crown, and our sages explain, adorned with only the royal crown, to show the nations and ministers her beauty, for she was of beautiful appearance. And Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's bidding brought by the chamberlains, understandable. And the king grew furious, and his wrath seethed within him. And the king spoke to the sages, those knowledgeable of the times, for this was the king's custom, to bring all judicial questions before those who were versed in every law and statute, those close to him, so that he could present his questions to them. And they were Karshena, Shetar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memuchan, who we understand is Haman. And these were the 7 ministers of Persia and Media who had access to the king and ranked highest in the kingdom. And he said to them, by law, what should be done with Queen Vashti for failing to obey the order of King Ahasuerus brought by the chamberlains? And Memuchan, who is Haman, declared before the king and the ministers, it is not only against the king that Queen Vashti has sinned, but against all the ministers and all the nations and all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Now you want to talk about patriarchal society. For the word of the queen's act of belittling the king will reach all the women, causing them to also belittle their husbands in their eyes. For they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded that Queen Vashti be brought before him, and yet she did not come. And this very day the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard the queen's deed, will repeat it to all the king's nobles, creating much disgrace and anger. So if it please the king, let a royal edict issue from him, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media, and let it not be revoked, that Vashti did not appear in front of King Ahasuerus. And let the king confer her royal title upon another woman who is better than she. And the king's decree about what he will do to Vashti shall be heard throughout his kingdom, for it is great, and all the women will give respect to their husbands, from the greatest to the smallest. And the idea pleased the king and his ministers. And the king did as Memucan advised. And he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its script and to each nation in its language, saying that every man shall be master in his home, and that he speak the language of his nation. And so that ends chapter 1.
So when Haman, the evil consigliere of the king, who's the villain of the tale, when his name is mentioned, it's customary to boo. Now, the Megillah readings that we went to, they said right at the beginning, okay, we can't boo for every single mention of his name because this is going to take hours. So we did it 3 times. So I'm going to pick a couple times to do it. Okay.
And bless you, Marjorie Holler, for donating to the poor through our website today. All donations today to accidentaltalmudist.org at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org pass through us and go to the poor.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. You also are we love you. You're such a valued member of the community.
Amen.
As are all of you watching right now.
Amen.
Okay. After these events, when King Ahasuerus' wrath had subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed upon her. So the king's attendants advised, let virgin maidens of beautiful appearance be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and let them gather every virgin maiden of beautiful appearance to Shushan the capital, to the harem, under the charge of Hege, chamberlain of the king, custodian of the women, and let their cosmetic lotions be provided. And let the maiden who finds favor in the king's eyes become queen in Vashti's stead. The plan pleased the king, and he enacted it. There was a Judean man in Shushan, the capital, and his name was Mordecai, son of Yair. So this was an Israeli guy, basically. I think he was in Jerusalem during the times of the temple.
And he was a member of the Sanhedrin who had seen the destruction of the first temple and was exiled in the Babylonian exile and ended up in Shushan.
Okay. His name was Mordecai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish. Whoops.
Just skip a page.
Okay.
Commentary.
Okay. A Benjaminite. So he was a member of the tribe of Benjamin. He had been exiled from Jerusalem with the exiles who had been exiled along with Jehoniah, king of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had sent into exile, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had sent in exile. He had raised Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. This is an enduring mystery of Jewish history. What exactly was their relationship? Some say it was uncle-niece, some say husband-wife, some say cousins. I don't have a lot of clarity on that, but they were related. She had neither father nor mother. The maiden had beautiful features and a lovely complexion. And after her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as a daughter. It happened that when the king's order and edict became known, and many maidens were gathered to Shushan, the capital, under the charge of Haggai, Esther was taken to the palace under the charge of Haggai, custodian of the women. Was Haggai a woman?
No, like a eunuch. A eunuch.
Okay. Yeah. The maiden found favor in his eyes and won his kindness. She charmed him. So he rushed to provide her with her cosmetic lotions and meals, as well as the 7 maidens from the king's palace, which she was entitled to be provided with. He treated her and her maidens differently, pampering the harem. Esther did not divulge her race or ancestry, since Mordecai had instructed her not to divulge it. So she didn't tell anybody if she was Jewish, but she still kept practicing Judaism, and she observed Shabbat. And the way she observed Shabbat was she had 7 maids, and she gave them each... She had a different maid for every day of the week, I believe, so that she could know when a certain maid came in, it was Shabbos, and then that person could kind of help her observe Shabbat. But that maid that was the maid on Shabbat didn't know anything was different because she was only there that one day of the week. So nobody suspected anything, if that makes sense. Esther,
here it's Chagai.
Mm-hmm. So everyday Mordecai. I think we missed something. So Mordecai. So now
Everyday Mordecai.
Let's take a think about this. This woman Esther, who he was raising, was plucked from her home and thrown into the palace to marry a non-Jewish king, and he was worried about her. So he would stroll in front of the harem courtyard to find out how Esther was faring and what would be done with her. When each maiden's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus, after undergoing the prescribed 12-month care for women, for only then would their period of beauty care be completed, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetic lotions with which the maiden would appear before the king, she would be provided with whatever she requested to accompany her from the house of the women to the palace. In the evening she would go, and in the morning she would return to the second harem under the charge of Shaashgaz, the king's chamberlain, custodian of the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless the king desired her, whereupon she would be summoned by name. And when the time came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, who was Mordecai's uncle, who had adopted her as a daughter, to go to the king, she did not request anything other than when Chagai, the king's chamberlain, custodian of the women, would advise. Esther found favor in the eyes of all who beheld her. She was very charming and charismatic. Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to the palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won his favor and kindness more than all the virgins. He placed the royal crown upon her head, so she wasn't a concubine now. She was actually his legal wife and the king, legal according to the law of Shushan, not according to Jewish law, and made her queen in Vashti's stead. The king made a grand feast for all his ministers and servants, the Feast of Esther. And he offered relief for the provinces and gave presents befitting a king. When the virgins were gathered a second time, and Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, as Esther would not divulge her ancestry or race, as Mordecai had instructed her, Esther followed Mordecai's instructions just as she had done while under his care. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains from the vessel guards, became angry and sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus, an assassination plot. The matter became known to Mordecai, and he informed Queen Esther.
It became known to him because he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and as such, one of the requirements of that is not only having incredible Torah learning, these are the head sages of the nation, but also they had to speak all the languages of the world, which at that time was the 70 languages of the
that's
world.
Why he knew.
And that's why he overheard. Remember, this was the most massive empire in the world, and there were people there, all kinds of officials from, distant provinces who spoke other languages. And these two thought that nobody understood what they were talking about, but Mordecai did. And that's why he tuned into their plot to murder the king.
So he informed Queen Esther of this plot. Esther informed the king of it in Mordecai's name. The matter was investigated. The matter was investigated, and the two were hanged on the gallows. This was recorded in the Book of Chronicles before the king. Chapter 3.
This begins chapter 3. Reminder, you can fulfill your obligation to donate to the poor today by donating through us at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, and we will pass everything through today's donations to the poor. Chapter 3. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, and raised him up, and he placed his seat above all his fellow ministers. And all the king's servants at the king's gate kneeled and bowed to Haman, for so had the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow. And the king's servants at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" It happened when they had said to him day after day, and he did not listen to them, they told Haman to see if Mordecai's words would prevail, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And Haman saw that Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow to him, and Haman was filled with wrath. And he disdained the thought of killing only Mordecai, for they had informed him of Mordecai's nationality. So Haman sought to annihilate all the Jews throughout Ahasuerus's entire kingdom, Mordecai's people. Has Jew hatred ever been rational?
He had a problem with one guy.
He had a problem with one guy.
Decided to kill the entire people.
And his solution is kill the entire Jewish people. Things don't change so much. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus's reign, a pur, which is a lot, like a lottery, was cast before Haman for every day and every month, and it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So note that we think of Rosh Hashanah, which happens in Tishrei. Well, that's the beginning of the year, so that must be the first month. But according to the counting of months in the Bible, the first month is the month of Nisan, in which there's Passover, because that's the month we emerged from slavery in Egypt. And so the 12th month is the month right before that, Adar, which is this month in which we celebrate Purim.
If you're confused about that, you're not alone, because that has never made sense to me.
Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is one nation scattered. Now this is the logic and the evil explanations of Jew haters throughout time. The Midrash on this actually expands this letter and this logical derivation that Haman gave Ahasuerus of why they need to kill all the Jews, right? So listen how the twisted logic works. So Haman says to King Ahasuerus, there is one nation scattered and dispersed among the nations throughout the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are unlike those of any other nation, and they do not observe the king's laws, a lie, because it is part of our law that we obey the laws in the land where we live. And it is not in the king's interest to tolerate them. So if it please the king, let it be written that they be destroyed. And I will weigh out 10,000 silver talents through the king's functionaries to be deposited in the king's treasury. So if it's so important for the king to do this, why does Haman need to bribe him with an astronomical amount of money? So the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hamdata the Agagite, persecutor of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you and the nation is yours to do with as you please. And the king's scribes were summoned during the first month of the year, Nisan, on its 13th day. And all that Haman had commanded to the king's satraps and the governors of each province and to the nobles of each nation was written to each province according to its script and each nation according to its language. This communication system was a revolutionary technology in the history of the world. It was like a Pony Express, but it allowed Persia to send messages from the capital to the outer districts or across the whole empire in a much, much shorter time than previously when they would send messengers who themselves would go all the way to wherever they were going. Now they had this system of horses and camels and stables. Each one would run for a day and then rest and then be replaced by the next runner. And so this was a high-tech communication system, which made it all the more dangerous when that system was used to promote the destruction of all the Jews in the world. That'll become important later. So it was written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent with couriers to all the provinces of the king to annihilate, murder, and destroy all the Jews from young to old, children and women on one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Right? Extra incentive to kill the Jews. And the message of the letter was that the law be proclaimed in every province clearly to all the nations, that they should be ready for that day. And the couriers hurried out by order of the king, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan the capital, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was in turmoil. So ends chapter 3. And a big Yasher Koach to Sandra McMurray for donating to the poor through our website today. All donations to donate.accidentaltalmudist.org today will pass through us and go to the needy.
Yay, Sandy, thank you. Okay.
Chapter 4.
By the way, I heard that there was another reason that Haman had a problem with Mordecai, which is that Haman wanted his own daughter to marry the king,
Ah.
which would then connect, and then their son would to keep Haman's family in control. So Haman's daughter is going to come back into the story later. Mordecai knew all that had occurred. Mordecai tore his clothes and donned sackcloth and ash. He went out into the city and cried out with a great and bitter cry. He went up until the king's gate, for it is not to enter the king's gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the order of the king reached, and his law was proclaimed, there was great mourning among the Jews, I bet. And fasting, crying, and wailing, sackcloth and ash were spread out for the masses. Esther's maids and chamberlains came and told her, and the queen was terribly afraid. She sent garments to dress Mordecai and to remove his sackcloth from upon him, but he did not accept them. Esther summoned Hatak, one of the king's chamberlains he had placed in her service, and she commanded him to go to Mordecai to find out what this was and what this was for. Hatak went out to Mordecai to the city square that is in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the meaning of the money that Haman promised to weigh out to the king's treasuries for the right to destroy the Jews. Haman was super rich. He also gave him the message of the edict that was proclaimed in Shushan, calling for their annihilation, to show it to Esther and to tell her about it, and to instruct her to go to the king to beseech him and plead with him on behalf of her nation. Hatak went and relayed the words of Mordecai to Esther, and Esther spoke to Hatak, commanding him to relay to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes to the king and enters the inner courtyard without being summoned, his is but one verdict: execution. You can't just go up to the king and plead for your people. That's not how it worked. The only exception is the person to whom the king extends his golden scepter. He may live. And I have not been summoned, says Esther, to come before the king for 30 days now. They relayed Esther's words to Mordecai. So basically Esther's saying, I wish I could help, but, I can't just go in and talk to the king. Mordecai said to respond to Esther, "Do not think that you will find refuge in the king's palace from among all the Jews. For if you will remain silent at this time, relief and salvation will come to the Jews from another source. And you and the house of your father will be lost. And who knows?
Mi Yodea, famous verse.
If about this time next year on the day of annihilation, you will retain your royal position and thus find refuge in the palace." Esther said to respond to Mordecai, "Go and gather all the Jews who are in Shushan and fast for my sake. Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days, night and day." Whoa. "My maids and I shall also fast in the same way. Then I shall go to the king, although it is unlawful, and as I have perished, so I will perish."
Yeah, we complain about a 12-hour fast. They did 3 days.
Mordecai transgressed and did all that Esther had instructed him.
Because they fasted on Passover. This period when this is happening is Passover.
Oh.
And so obviously it's prohibited to fast on Passover, but it was a fasting for national salvation.
Oh.
And so he did it.
Didn't know that part.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that ends chapter 4. Chapter 5. Esther goes to the king. It was on the 3rd day that Esther donned garments of royalty and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace, facing the palace. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the palace, facing the chamber entrance. And it happened that when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, she found favor in his eyes. And the king extended the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What need do you have, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it will be granted to you." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to the feast that I have prepared for him." And the king said, "Rush Haman to fulfill Esther's bidding." And the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And at the wine feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your plea? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." And Esther replied and said, "My plea and my request is this: if I found favor in the king's eyes, and if it please the king to grant my plea and fulfill my request, and let the king and Haman come to the feast that I shall prepare for them tomorrow." and then I shall fulfill the king's request. So on that day, Haman left the king's presence happy and in good spirits, right? The whole essence of Haman and all these, royal officials, government administrators, was fawning and flattering and getting close to the king. And here's Haman at a private feast between the king and the queen. He's got it made, he's telling himself. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and Mordecai neither rose nor showed fear before him, Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Haman restrained himself, went to his house. He sent for and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman told them of his glorious wealth and his many sons, and about the extent to which the king had promoted him, and how he had raised him above all the king's ministers and servants. And Haman said furthermore, Queen Esther invited nobody but me, along with the king, to the feast that she prepared. And tomorrow, too, I am invited to her feast along with the king. And yet, all this is worthless to me whenever I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate.
Just don't pay any attention. I tell my kids.
Irrational. So his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, okay, so have gallows made 50 cubits high. And in the morning, tell the king, since you're so close to him, to have Mordecai hanged on it. And then you will be able to go happily with the king to the feast. And Haman was pleased with the idea, and he made the gallows. So ends chapter 5. We pass on to chapter 6, and remember, all donations today pass through us to the needy. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, and you fulfill your obligation to give gifts to the poor today.
On that night, the king's sleep escaped him. He had insomnia. He told his attendants to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written that Mordecai had informed on Bigtana and Teresh. Those were the traitors, 2 of the king's chamberlains from the vessel guards who had sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The king said, what honor and greatness has been accorded to Mordecai for this? The king's attendants said, nothing was done for him. The king said, well, who is in the courtyard? Haman, had come to the outer courtyard of the king's chambers to tell the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had made for him. Just at the moment when the king wanted to honor him. The king's attendant said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the courtyard. The king said, let him enter. Haman entered, and the king said to him, what should be done for a man whom the king wants to honor? Referring to Mordecai, of course. Haman said to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? Haman said to the king, for a man whom the king wishes to honor, let them bring a royal garment that the king has worn, a horse upon which the king has ridden, and the royal crown that has been placed on his head. And let the garment and the horse be entrusted in the hands of one of the king's governing ministers, and let them dress the man who the king wishes to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the city square, proclaiming before him, so is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. The king said to Haman, hurry, take the garment and the horse, just as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gates. Such a great moment. Omit nothing from all you have spoken. Haman took the garment and dressed Mordecai. Oh man, that must have been hard for him. And he led him through the city square and proclaimed before him, so is the man whom the king... So is done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Mordecai then returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried to his house in mourning and with his head covered. Haman told his wife Zeresh, who's a big part of the problem here.
And by the way, you mentioned the daughter earlier. Mm-hmm. So when it says that Haman hurried to his house in mourning and with his head covered, okay, it was really bad what happened to him, that he wanted to have himself honored, and he himself had to honor Mordecai.
Right.
But why would you be in mourning?
Yeah. So
the Midrash teaches that when his daughter saw him walking in front of Mordecai and realized that she wasn't going to be married to the king and that her father had totally fallen and was being deposed, that she killed herself.
Yeah, jumped out the window.
She jumped off a building.
Fell into a...
I think they were throwing poop down onto the street, something like that.
Not pleasant.
But at any rate, that's why he's in mourning, and that's what he's coming to report to his wife, Not only
I
that
didn't know
he's
that.
been totally deposed, but that their daughter is dead.
Oh, I knew that happened. I didn't realize it happened at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends about all that had happened to him. Now, nothing has happened to him. It's not like he's a victim here. He's just asked
He's
to...
done it. He's created all this.
His wise men and his wife Zeresh told him, if this Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall...
Hold on a second. Okay.
Is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail over him, for you will certainly fall before him.
Such an odd statement, right? I mean, they're ready to kill all the Jews in the world, and now the wife is saying, oh, if he's a Jew, you're going to fall before him. I mean, talk about fair weather friends.
Perplexing. Yeah, suddenly she's throwing her husband under the bus. While they were still talking with him, the chamberlains of the king arrived, and they rushed to bring Haman, boo, to the feast that Esther had prepared.
Now, there's a note here about this, right? So, if this Mordecai before you have begun to fall is of Jewish descent. So the note, Zeresh said, this nation is compared to the stars and to the earth. When they descend to the earth. And when they rise up to the heavens and to the stars. That's from Rashi. So the advisors and Zeresh are not only referring to Haman's personal fall, but to the historical falling of Amalek to the Jewish people. You have begun to fall in the times of Joshua and later King Saul. So will you fall now in the times of Mordecai. Right? In other words, they were realizing you wanted to kill this guy. He bothered you. All good. You tried to kill all the Jews. They're realizing that whenever that's been attempted in the past and since, whoever tries to do that might do some harm, but will end up destroyed. And now they're reminding him of history.
Yeah, if only more people now would remember that lesson. Want to turn the page?
And that's the chapter. Did you finish that? Just checking. You said while they were still talking.
The feast, yeah, I finished it.
Okay. And so ends chapter 6. And a big Yasher Koach. May you be strengthened to Janice Beanstalk and Christine Orech, who are donating to the poor through our website. All donations today pass through us to the needy. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Chapter 7. The king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. Again, on the second day, during the wine feast, the king said to Esther, what is your plea, Queen Esther? It will be granted to you. And what is your request? Even if it will be up to half the kingdom, it will be done. And Queen Esther replied and said, if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted to me by my plea, and the lives of my people by my request, for my people and I have been sold to be annihilated, killed, and destroyed. And had we been sold as slaves and maidservants, I would have kept silent. I am speaking up because the persecutor is not concerned with the king's loss of manpower and intends to kill us. King Achashverosh said to Queen Esther, who is this? And which one is he who had the audacity to do such a thing? And Esther said, a man who is a persecutor and an enemy.
Drum roll.
This evil Haman.
Such a satisfying moment.
Haman was aghast in the presence of the king and the queen. The king arose in his wrath from the wine feast and went to the orchard's garden. And Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther for his life because he saw that the king's hostility towards him was determined. The king returned from the orchard's garden to the wine feast chamber, and Haman was falling on the divan upon which Esther was reclining, and the king sees like him basically lying on her. Does he also intend to have his way with the queen while I am in the palace? And as soon as these words left the king's mouth, the face of Haman was covered in shame. And Harvona, one of the chamberlains, he was mentioned at the very beginning of the Megillah, who stood before the king, said, furthermore, there are the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai.
Oh, there's already gallows.
Who spoke up for the king's good and saved him from assassination. And that gallows that he made for your hero is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on it.
So convenient. It's already there.
And they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath abated.
So if you've ever heard the expression hoisted with his own petard,
that was it.
That's it.
We also have a teaching that this Harvona, who spoke up at the perfect moment and was otherwise, not part of the story, it's like that person who's just there, say the right word at the right time and turns history, is often attributed that it was Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, stepping in at that moment. So ends chapter 7.
On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, persecutor of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told the king how he was related to her. The king removed his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate. Oh, how sweet it is! Esther again spoke before the king and fell before his feet. She cried and beseeched him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot that he had plotted against the Jews. So that still decree is still on the books. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther. And Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, if it pleased the king, and if I had found favor before him, and the idea is proper before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to return the letters containing the plot of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who had written to destroy the Jews who lived throughout the king's provinces. For how can I endure and survive while beholding the calamity that will befall my people? And how can I endure and survive while beholding the destruction of my family? King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Haman's estate to Esther, and he was hanged on the gallows for raising his hand against the Jews. As for you, write letters concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal them with the king's signet ring, because a letter written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring should not be withdrawn. The king's scribes were then summoned in the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, on its 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai instructed the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the nobles of the provinces from India to Cush, 127 provinces, to each province according to its script, and to each nation according to its language, and to the Jews according to their script and language. He wrote it in King Ahasuerus' name and sealed it with the king's signet ring. He sent the letters by couriers on horseback, that's what you were talking about, riders of speedy camels. That shows how much I know. I didn't even know camels could be speedy.
Oh, quite speedy.
I didn't know. The Menei Harachamim, the edict stated that the king had allowed the Jews of every city to gather and stand up for their lives, to annihilate, kill, and destroy every army of any nation or province that oppresses them, including their children and women, and to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Copies of the edict were sent to be proclaimed as law in every province, clearly to all the nations, and so that the Jews would be ready for that day to take revenge on their enemies. The couriers, riders of speedy camels, left urgently and hurriedly by order of the king, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, the capital.
It's important to note what he's saying. So they couldn't rescind the decree that said it was permitted to kill all the Jews on that one day that Haman was chosen. So they didn't rescind that. What they said is another order that the Jews can rise up and kill anyone who comes to try to kill them. Now, it's always permitted to defend yourself. Right. So what really changed? And it just shows how important it is to sort of have momentum, to have the perception that you are on the side of righteousness and of good, and that message is spreading throughout the kingdom and that people get it. So now the enemies of the Jews are going to realize they're on the wrong side of history. Most of them will back down. The ones who still want to, pursue their Jew hatred and kill us, they will fall, and they all fell, right? So the Jews now rose up against them, and with no casualties on the Jewish side, were able to rise up and kill only those people who were trying to kill us, right? So that sense of perception of being on the right side of history, very important.
And Mordecai emerged from the king's presence wearing a royal garment of blue and white, a large golden crown, a shawl of fine linen, and a garment of purple wool. And the city of Shushan celebrated and rejoiced. For the Jews, there was light and happiness, joy and glory.
And think about that. It hasn't happened yet. The enemies have not yet been defeated. Just the letters went out.
Right.
but they already realize that the tide has
has
turned.
turned. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's edict had reached, there was happiness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Many of the Gentiles converted to Judaism, for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Fun fact.
Awe might be a better word there.
For awe of the Jews? Mm-hmm. Well, fear also. I mean.
Right, but it's not a coercive conversion. Right? They just wanted to join this side of history.
So here's a fun fact. I think some of Haman, so Haman, as we're about to see, had 10 sons, but he had many other children. And I think some of them were among that group that converted because, is it in the Gemara, the Talmud, that says that the descendants of Haman became Jews, and not just Jews, but very righteous scholars in Bnei Brak. Am I making that up?
I mean, 10 sons were hanged. So
No.
you're saying there's other sons.
I'm talking, he had many, many sons.
Okay.
Those 10 were the really eager ones to
fulfill
No, but
the Judaistic mission. I don't remember that. Yeah. I believe you.
I'm pretty sure I heard that the descendants of Haman became Torah scholars in Bnei Brak.
And here's a note.
If I'm wrong, I'm really sorry about that.
And here's a note. We'll look it up. I'm sure you're right. And here's a note about this verse, that many of the Gentiles converted to Judaism for fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Or that which the Jews feared fell upon them. The awe of heaven experienced by the Jews was of such intensity that it infused even their countrymen, inspiring them to join the Jewish people. Jews are mandated to be a light unto the nations. This verse reminds us that it is not only our actions that impress our neighbors, but the convictions that drive them, right? The fear of the Jews, not that they were afraid of us, but they've witnessed and saw our fear of heaven, our awe of God, our fear of heaven. We can deal ethically in business, lead refined lives, and be model citizens. But what moves the onlooker is the realization that we live this way because of our dedication to the Holy One, blessed be He. When our non-Jewish peers see how our fundamental fear of heaven colors all our deeds, they too will begin to live a more divinely inspired life. So ends chapter 8. And some more donations from Jill Pearlstein.
Oh, thank
Yasher
you,
Koach,
Jill.
may you be strengthened. Reminder, all donations to us today through donate.accidentaltalmudist.org pass through us, today's donations, and go to the needy so you can fulfill your obligation to make gifts to the poor on Purim. Chapter 9, basically the last chapter, because chapter 10 that Nina will read is only 3 sentences. Chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, when the time for implementing the king's edict and law had arrived, on the day the enemies of the Jews had thought that they would dominate them, the situation was reversed, and the Jews dominated their enemies. And the Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to attack those who sought to harm them. No man stood in their way, for fear of them had fallen upon all the nations. And all the ministers of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's functionaries exalted the Jews, for fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was now the most prominent official in the king's palace, and his fame was spreading throughout all the provinces. People said that the man Mordecai was steadily rising in power, and the Jews struck at all their enemies, attacking them with the sword, killing and destroying. They did with their enemies as they wanted. In Shushan, the capital, the Jews killed and depleted 500 men, as well as Parshandata, Dalphon, Aspata, Porata, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizata, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamdata, the persecutor of the Jews. But they took none of the spoils. That day, the number of fatalities in Shushan, the capital, was relayed to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan, the capital, the Jews killed and depleted 500 men, as well as the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the other provinces of the king? What is your plea? It shall be granted to you. What is your additional request? It shall be done. And Esther replied, if it please the king, let the Jews of Shushan be also allowed to do tomorrow what was lawful today. Let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows.
They were already dead.
But let it be seen, let it be witnessed. The king ordered this done, and the law was proclaimed in Shushan, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. And the Jews of Shushan gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Shushan, but took none of the spoils. And the rest of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered and stood up for their lives to relieve themselves of their enemies, and they killed 75,000 of their enemies, and they killed 75,000 of their foes, but took none of the spoils. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, they rested on the 14th day and established it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. And the Jews who were in Shushan, the capital, gathered on the 13th and 14th of Adar and rested on the 15th and established it as a day of feasting and rejoicing. And thus the Perazi Jews, those who live in cities that are unwalled, Perazot, make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of rejoicing, feasting, and a holiday, and the sending of portions of food one to another. Mordechai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews living throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, instructing them to obligate themselves to celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, like the days upon which the Jews rested, having been relieved of their enemies, and the month that had been transformed for them from one of sorrow to joy, from mourning to festivity, to make them days of feasting and rejoicing, of the sending of food portions to one another. Right, we send gifts to one another and gifts to the poor. For that, we're taking donations today through Accidental Talmudist. And the Jews accepted as an obligation that which they began to observe voluntarily, and that which Mordechai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, persecutor of all the Jews, plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and he cast a pur, which is a lot, as in lottery, to confound them and destroy them. But when she came before the king, he stated verbally and conveyed with letters to reverse Haman's evil plot against the Jews upon his own head. And he and his sons were hanged upon the gallows, and they therefore called these days Purim. For the pur, right, lot as in lottery, plural Purim, and established the holiday and recorded its narrative for posterity because of all the events of this epistle, which recounts what prompted the characters to act as they did and what happened to them. And the Jews established and accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants and upon all who might convert to their faith to annually celebrate these 2 days, according to their script, on their proper dates, never to be abolished, meaning that even the days of Mashiach, we will be celebrating Purim, though some other holidays, not so much. And these days be commemorated and celebrated in every generation, by every family in every province and every city, and that these days of Purim will never depart from among the Jews, nor will their commemoration cease from their descendants. The next year, Queen Esther, the daughter of Avihail and Mordechai the Jew, wrote about the enormity of all the aspects of the miracle to establish the holiday with this second Purim epistle. And Mordechai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of Ahasuerus' kingdom, words of peace and truth, instructing them to obligate themselves to observe these days of Purim on their proper dates in the manner that Mordechai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, just as they had accepted upon themselves and upon their descendants the observance of the fasts and their lamentations. And the request of Esther confirmed the aspects of these Purim days, and the story was included, the final book to be added, in Scripture, in the Bible. So ends chapter 9.
Okay, now we're going to finish with the final paragraph.
Actually, right, because Hanukkah did not get added to the Bible. Purim was the last book.
Hanukkah's
later
than Purim. Okay.
But not in the Bible.
Right. Ahasuerus levied a tax upon the mainland and the islands of the sea, and the entire history of his power and strength and the story behind Mordechai's prominence, having been promoted by the king, are recorded in the Book of Chronicles of the king of Media and Persia. For Mordechai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, a respected leader to the Jews, and was found favorable by a majority of his brethren. He sought goodness for his people and spoke up for the welfare of all their children. Let's backtrack a little bit here.
And that's the end.
That's the end. Mordechai was found favorable by a majority of his brethren. Who were the holdouts? I mean, this is so typical Jews. Two Jews, three opinions. We can never agree on anything. This guy saved the entire people. And there's still some stiff-necked Jews that are not impressed. No words. That always makes me laugh, because it's just, there's always those few people that just aren't going to play ball for whatever reason.
And there are a couple of different views on that, right? Why were there these holdouts who were not finding Mordecai's actions favorable? One might think that this would be the people who said, well, if Mordecai had just bowed to Haman in the first place, none of this would have happened. But that view is wrong, because the sages teach that Haman wore an idol, like of idolatry, on a chain around his neck. And bowing to Haman would you'd have to bow to the idol around his neck. And that's something that Mordecai could not do. He wasn't going to assimilate and play ball to the extent that he would commit idolatry. So we don't accept that. If there were Jews who were not impressed with Mordecai because of that, those Jews were, 100% and fabulously wrong. But there were also Jews who said that they were members of the Sanhedrin. Mordecai was a member of the Sanhedrin, and because he remained involved as the second in command of the whole Persian kingdom, it meant that he didn't have time to study Torah. And so could he remain in the Sanhedrin as one who doesn't have time? And the answer is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives, and this is consistent with the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, which says that one who involves themselves in the affairs of the people, who prays for them and attends to their needs, he can't give up Torah study. But if his Torah study is diminished, then still the amount of time he puts into Torah study will be blessed, meaning he'll get much more out of it than he would otherwise, even though it's a small amount of time, because he's so involved in the needs of the people. So even if you're busy, find a little time for Torah study, and it will be blessed.
And with that ends our presentation of the Megillah, because you're going live at 2 and we have a party to go to.
45 minutes.
So we gotta skedaddle.
But that party's after. We're fine.
Oh, I thought we were going now.
No, we're fine.
Oh, okay. So no rush. I was like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get there? Okay.
Yes, we will. I will be live again in 45 minutes today to do today's page of Talmud. AT Daily is at 2 p.m. today, and we do that every day. In case you've never been with us, you could check it out Sunday through Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific, Fridays at noon Pacific, Saturday nights after Shabbat ends in LA, and we do 1 page a day of the Talmud for 7.5 years. Reminder that all donations to us today pass through us to the poor. The other 364 days of the year, if you donate to us, you are enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world, and that is a fabulous and worthy endeavor and a big mitzvah for you. May you be blessed. But today's donations all go to the poor, enable you to fulfill this obligation mentioned in the Megillah, in the Book of Esther, to give gifts to the poor on this day. Also to send gifts to your friends, to read, and ideally to hear the Megillah read in Hebrew. But if you read it yourself, you can fulfill that obligation if it's not possible for you to get to a synagogue and hear it read in Hebrew. And also to enjoy a Purim Suda, to enjoy a Purim meal. One last thing, it is customary to read the following 2 paragraphs after the Megillah is read.
But this is a bracha. Is that do even if it's read in English?
I'm teaching it to you.
Okay.
This is not a blessing that we would only say with a minyan. Okay. So you need not respond amen. I'm just teaching you what we say. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who wages our battles, defends our rights, avenges the wrong done to us, punishes our oppressors in our behalf, and brings retribution upon all our mortal enemies. Blessed are you, Lord, who exacts payment in behalf of his people Israel from all their oppressors, God who delivers. And then all read together. The rows of Jacob thrilled with joy and exulted when they beheld Mordecai garbed in royal blue. You have always been their salvation, their hope in every generation, to make known that all who place their hope in you shall not be put to shame, nor shall all who trust in you be disgraced forever. Cursed be Haman, who sought to destroy me, right? We view ourselves as if we live through these events. Cursed be Haman who sought to destroy me. Blessed be Mordecai the Jew. Cursed be Zeresh, the wife of Haman, who terrified me. Blessed be Esther, who interceded on my behalf. Cursed be all the wicked. Blessed be all the righteous. And may Harvona also be remembered favorably. The character who spoke up about the gallows. And with that, we complete our reading of the whole Megillah. Any final thoughts? We've shared a lot of thoughts. I'm sure you're all tired of hearing us talk. So that is the Book of Esther for today. I'll be back in about 42 minutes with today's daf. We're working our way through Tractate Bava Metzia in the Talmud. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.